Following the surrender of German forces in 1945, Allied soldiers uncovered the horrific reality of Nazi death camps such as Auschwitz, Dachau and Belsen. At least 11 million people, including Jews, Slavs, disabled people and homosexuals, had been murdered as a result of Nazi genocidal policy. That policy was directly inspired by the pseudoscience of eugenics, the idea that it's possible and desirable to improve the genetic quality of a human population. And while the Allies naturally abhorred the detestable crimes of the Nazis and punished the wrongdoers after the war, the uncomfortable truth is that Britain and America were the original breeding grounds for those same eugenic ideas. Modern eugenics had its origin in the 19th century with British scientist Francis Galton. A polymath who made important contributions to many fields, Galton was hugely influenced by his cousin Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. In his first chapter, titled Variation Under Domestication, Darwin explains how different breeds within a species are often produced from a common ancestor by a process of selective breeding. Galton was the first person to apply Darwin's ideas to humans. Convinced that traits like intelligence and ability were entirely determined by genetics, he asked whether it would be possible to give the more suitable races of blood a better chance of prevailing over the less suitable than they otherwise would have had. In 1883, Galton gave his new idea a name, eugenics, which he defined as the science of improving stock. By the turn of the 20th century, Britain's ruling establishment was looking for ways to make Britain a stronger, healthier and more productive nation. Galton's ideas began to attract interest. Eugenics was seen as a panacea. If the population was simply made better, then so many problems would be solved, from crime to poverty to mental illness. The liberal reformer William Beveridge, architect of the welfare state, and the economist John Maynard Keynes, a key thinker in 20th century liberal economics, were both prominent supporters. Even British liberals and progressives became enthusiastic about policies such as forced sterilisation, which, if enacted, they believed could eradicate negative traits from the population. These negative traits ranged from specific mental disabilities to more abstract characteristics such as laziness or criminality, which many at the time believed were inherited. The Eugenics Education Society was founded in 1907. It argued, among other things, that poverty was rooted in the genetic deficiency of the working classes, and that the feeble-minded should be prevented from having children. 30 years before he led Britain to victory against Nazi Germany, Winston Churchill was honorary vice president of the Eugenics Education Society. In 1910, Churchill warned Prime Minister Herbert Henry Asquith about the very terrible danger to the race posed by the multiplication of the unfit, and as Home Secretary, Churchill went on to propose a series of eugenic policies, including forced sterilisation and the prevention of marriage between those judged mentally unfit. He also planned labour colonies where the criminally feeble-minded could be detained. Long before anyone knew Hitler's name, Churchill was using the sort of language that would later be used by the Nazis to describe those who failed to live up to the standards of the master race. Around the same time, eugenics took root in the United States. In 1906, the inventor of cornflakes, J.H. Kellogg, founded the Race Betterment Foundation in Michigan. In 1911, the eugenicist Charles Davenport founded the Eugenics Record Office in New York. Kellogg and Davenport believed that eugenic policies could alleviate the economic burden caused by certain undesirable members of society, especially the disabled and the mentally ill. They enjoyed the financial backing of huge corporate foundations, including the Carnegie Institute and the Rockefeller Foundation. They held conferences, printed adverts for eugenic marriages, and published their research in journals and newspapers. The campaigns worked. In 1907, the state of Indiana passed the first compulsory sterilization law in the world. By 1924, 15 different states had passed similar legislation. These laws were passed in the hope that those deemed unfit to reproduce and the mentally ill wouldn't be able to pass on their inferior genes to the next generation. And these were popular policies. A 1937 Fortune magazine poll found that 2/3 of Americans supported eugenic sterilization of mental defectives, and 63% supported sterilization of criminals. Between 1907 and 1963, over 65,000 people were sterilized against their will. Relative to the American population, a disproportionate number of those targeted were Black, Hispanic and Native Native American women. This demonstrates just how quickly the idea of eradicating negative traits was unmasked as a racist agenda. Eugenics led American policymakers to acts even more atrocious than forced sterilization. A 1911 Carnegie report explored 18 different potential methods for removing defective genetic attributes and proposed euthanasia at number 8. One influential American textbook, Applied Eugenics by Paul Popenoe of the American Eugenics Society, argued that the first method which presents itself to cleanse the gene pool is execution. Its value in keeping up the standard of the race should not be underestimated. These ideas were actually put into practice in some states. One mental institution in Lincoln, Illinois, fed its patients milk that had been infected with tuberculosis in order that the genetically weak among them would be killed off. For eugenicists across the globe, the United States was the shining example of what eugenics could achieve. In Mein Kampf, published in 1925, Hitler lavished praise on American eugenicists. He claimed that he had studied with great interest the laws of several American states concerning prevention of reproduction by people whose progeny would be of no value or be injurious to the racial stock. Hitler and Churchill agreed. America was doing a great job of eradicating the unfit through eugenic legislation. One American eugenicist Hitler particularly admired was the lawyer Madison Grant. In 1916, Grant published The Passing of the Great Race, in which he lamented the pollution of the Nordic race by other inferior races. Grant was less coy than earlier eugenicists about the racist basis of his thinking. To him, the solution was clear. The American population needed to be purified through immigration restriction, selective breeding, and sterilization. He argued that a rigid system of selection through the elimination of those who were weak or unfit would solve the whole question in 100 years, as well as enable us to get rid of the undesirables who crowd our jails, hospitals, and insane asylums. The Passing of the Great Race was the first non-German book to be reprinted by the Nazis when they took power. Hitler himself wrote to Grant saying, "The book is my Bible." Hitler also deeply admired Henry Ford. As well as his motor company, Ford owned a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent, which, from 1920 onwards, regularly published articles on the so-called Jewish question. The articles employed all the classic anti-Semitic conspiratorial tropes, that Jews secretly ran the world, controlled the media, and started wars for their own profit. These articles proved highly popular among the American public, and were published in a book as the International Jew. This book went on to become a huge influence on many leaders of the Nazi Party. Baldur von Schirach, head of the Hitler Youth, said, "The decisive anti-Semitic book I was reading, and the book that influenced my comrades, was that book by Henry Ford, The International Jew. I read it and became anti-Semitic." Hitler had a large portrait of Ford in his office, and in 1938 Ford was awarded the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest medal Nazi Germany could bestow on a foreigner. He had, after all, helped to inspire the Nazi project. While eugenics may have been mainstream in Britain and America, there were those who saw it for what it was, a pseudoscience driven more by racism than by academic research. The anthropologist Franz Boas took aim at the eugenic idea that it's our genetic makeup that determines who we become. Instead, Boas argued our social and cultural environments play a much more significant role in shaping our character and ability than anything in our DNA. Notable among the opponents of eugenics was the English author and philosopher G.K. Chesterton. In 1913, when the British Parliament was debating the Mental Deficiency Act, which led to the institutionalization of those deemed mentally deficient, Chesterton argued that the aim of such institutionalization was to prevent any person whom these propagandists do not happen to think intelligent from having any wife or children. He pointed out that anyone could be accused of mental deficiency, from tramps and labourers to eccentric rustics, concluding, that is the situation, and that is the point. We are already under the eugenist state, and nothing remains to us but rebellion. This was Chesterton's battle cry to the people of Europe, long before the genocidal realities of eugenic thinking were brought to light. But his rallying cry was ignored. When Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933, one of the earliest laws he passed was the Law for the Prevention of Hereditary Diseased Offspring, which enabled the compulsory sterilization of citizens with genetic disorders. This legislation was directly based on the model eugenical sterilization law devised by the American eugenicist Harry L. Laughlin. Germany was imitating the American states, which had already passed the same laws. Harry Laughlin was given an honorary degree by Heidelberg University for his work in the science of racial cleansing. And upon returning from Germany in 1934, one California eugenicist congratulated his colleagues with the words, "You'll be interested to know that your work has played a powerful part in shaping the opinions of the group of intellectuals who are behind Hitler in this epoch-making program. Everywhere I sense that their opinions have been tremendously stimulated by American thought." Under the Nazi regime, over 400,000 people were sterilized against their will. Among them were the disabled, the blind, the deaf, those of mixed race, schizophrenics, and even alcoholics. 2 years after the Nazis began their sterilization program, they passed the infamous Nuremberg laws in 1935, which forbade marriage between Germans and Jews, and excluded Jews from Reich citizenship. These laws laid the legal groundwork for the persecution of Jews in Germany. They echoed American legislation, particularly the laws which banned marriage between white and black Americans, and the Jim Crow segregation laws, which institutionalized economic, social, and educational disadvantages for African Americans. It wasn't a great leap from sterilization to the next stage of Nazi racial policy, the involuntary euthanasia program, Action T4, which began in 1939. As part of this program, up to 300,000 disabled people were killed in psychiatric hospitals across Germany and the occupied territories. Patients were transferred from their hospitals to special treatment centres run by teams of SS men wearing white coats in order to give a sense of medical professionalism. They were then taken into shower blocks and gassed to death using bottled carbon monoxide. Their bodies were cremated en masse, and false death certificates were written up and sent to relatives. This euthanasia model was then adapted and expanded as part of the final solution to the Jewish question. At the end of 1941, the first extermination camps were constructed in occupied territories. These were places designed specifically for the purpose of genocide. It's not difficult to see how the same eugenic ideology that brought about forced sterilization led to segregation, forced euthanasia, and eventually to the extermination camps of Nazi Germany. In reaching its fullest expression, the British-born eugenics movement that inspired the Holocaust was revealed for what it was: a genocidal project of racial cleansing. Support for eugenics decreased dramatically during the 1940s as news emerged of what was happening at Auschwitz and other extermination camps, in the form of eyewitness reports from escaped prisoners and information leaked from the Nazi high command. What followed was a rewriting of history that erased the role played by the UK and the US in the development of eugenics. In the decades following World War II, many eugenic societies changed their names, and former eugenicists entered other fields of scientific research. The history books used in schools never mentioned it, but eugenic policies continued to be carried out in the US. As recently as 2011, a report revealed that 148 female prisoners in 2 California state prisons were sterilized without adequate informed consent between 2006 and 2011. In the post-war years, Britain and America helped to prosecute Nazi leaders during the Nuremberg trials. But as the chief US prosecutor wrote to President Harry Truman, the Allies themselves have done or are doing some of the very things we are prosecuting the Germans for. As the old Native American proverb has it, those who tell the stories rule the world. British and American eugenics is a story that has been purposefully not told, perhaps because to admit our involvement is simply too painful. It's easier just to pretend it never happened. But the words "never again" will only ring true if we tell the story of our own past and acknowledge the role played by Britain and the US in the rise of the eugenics movement, a movement that was key to the development of Hitler's genocidal ideology.
By the last decades of the 19th century, Darwin's theory was increasingly popular among Germany's intellectual elite. Darwin had claimed that humans and other mammals were the product of what he called natural selection, a blind struggle for existence where the fittest survived and reproduced, and the less fit died off. In his book, The Descent of Man, Darwin made clear that his idea of natural selection had implications for human society.
Charles Darwin clearly was a social Darwinist. He was not as rabid a social Darwinist as some of his followers later on, but he clearly did believe that Darwinism should be applied to human societies.
Darwin worried that civilized societies were harming humanity by helping the poor, caring for the sick, and otherwise saving those who nature would have killed off. Darwin feared that such humanitarianism could eventually destroy the human race. Darwin also predicted that in the future, the civilized races of mankind would exterminate the inferior ones. Darwin himself was ambivalent about some of the social implications of his theory. But in Germany, Darwin's ideas supplied a new generation of political leaders, social thinkers, and scientists with what they regarded as a biological justification for world domination.
If you read the scientists of the day in the late 19th and early 20th century, many of them were promoting racism and even racial extermination, extinction of races. They were promoting the gaining of living space. They were promoting competition, the things that we know of as social Darwinism. These were things being promoted by Charles Darwin himself to some degree, many other leading biologists.
The war of annihilation is a natural law, without which the organic world could not continue to exist at all. German zoologist Gustav Jaeger, 1870. Just as in nature, the struggle for existence is the moving principle of evolution and perfection, so also in world history, the destruction of the weaker nations through the stronger is a postulate of progress. German ethnologist Friedrich Hellwald, 1875. According to Darwin's theory, wars have always been of the greatest importance for the general progress of the human species. The physically weaker, the less intelligent, the morally lower, must give place to the stronger. German biologist Heinrich Ziegler, 1893.
Not all German Darwinists defended war as a biological imperative. Some, in fact, criticized it for undermining natural selection. They feared that wars in Europe would kill off too many of the superior races. Yet even these pacifist Darwinists tended to approve of wars waged against races they considered lower on the evolutionary scale, like the native peoples of Africa. And it was in Germany's colony in southwest Africa, now known as Namibia, that the social Darwinism of German military leaders moved from theory to practice in the years leading up to World War I. Between 1904 and 1908, the German military attempted to eradicate the Herero people in southwest Africa in what some scholars consider the first genocide of the 20th century. On October 2nd, 1904, General Lothar von Trotha issued what became known as his extermination order, declaring that the Hereros either had to leave German southwest Africa or face extinction. Herero men would be executed, and Herero women and children would be driven into the desert where they would die of starvation or dehydration. Von Trotha justified his extermination campaign by an explicit appeal to social Darwinism, telling one newspaper that human feelings of philanthropy could not override the law of Darwin's the struggle of the fittest. When von Trotha's extermination campaign provoked a backlash in Germany, a new plan was developed to move the remaining Hereros to concentration camps, where many more would ultimately die from malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion. In these death camps, the Hereros were subjected to medical experiments by German doctors, and their skulls were collected for shipment back to Germany to be studied by experts in racial science. By 1908, it's estimated that more than 80% of the Herero people had been eliminated from German Southwest Africa. Back in Europe, meanwhile, German military leaders prepared for the next conflict on their continent. In 1912, German General Friedrich von Bernhardi published his bestseller, Germany and the Next War. Bernhardi argued that the struggle for existence is, in the life of nature, the basis of all healthy development. Therefore, war is a biological necessity. Similar ideas could be found among the military leaders of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Count Franz Conrad von Hotzendorf has been called by one scholar the architect of the apocalypse for his formative role in World War I. The chief of the General Staff of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, von Hotzendorf, read Darwin as a young officer, and he soon applied the Darwinian worldview to his ideas about foreign relations. After World War I started, many German thinkers invoked Darwinian theory to justify the conflict, including prominent zoologist Ernst Haeckel, previously a pacifist.
Once it got going, there were many people who argued that it was a part of the Darwinian struggle for existence. Ernst Haeckel even wrote a book during the war in which he called it part of the struggle for existence, in which he argued that the perfidious French were using black colonial troops against the superior Germans, and he found that horrifying, that they would do such a thing. And so there were many people who were justifying the war on as part of the Darwinian struggle for existence.
In the end, Germany and its allies lost the First World War. But the ideology of social Darwinism that inspired its academic and military leaders survived for another day. Among the defeated soldiers of the German war machine was a young corporal in the Bavarian army. Intensely bitter at the defeat of Germany and its allies, the corporal found new purpose for his life by embracing an even more fanatical social Darwinism than that which had been adopted by the leaders of the Second Reich. Within 2 decades, the whole world would know the corporal's name.
Unser deutsches Volk Sieg heil! Sieg heil! Sieg heil! Sieg heil!
Scientific theories can have an influence on society, be it what is healthy to eat, whether some surgeries help or hinder, or even whether if the earth is flat. The theory does not need to be proven right, as even an idea on shaky ground can influence others' actions. One such theory would probably have one of the largest effects on the 20th century, as it would be used as a disgusting excuse for some of the world's worst atrocities. Following the scientific theory would lead to genocide, segregation, and social racial laws that, by modern standards, leave a disgusting taste in the mouth, a convenient excuse to allow unacceptable actions by individuals and governments alike. And even in contemporary times, the subject filters its way into modern-day society. It has mostly been used as an open door for misuse, scientific racism, and tyranny. Today we're looking at one of the most dangerous scientific ideas, especially when used to prove prejudice and be used as an excuse for callousness. The theory is of eugenics, and its long-reaching effects in the 19th and 20th century. As such, I'm going to rate this subject here 9 on my ethical scale. Welcome to the dark side of science. Our story starts with a very famous book by a much revered scientist, The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. The work was released in 1859 and is widely regarded as the foundation of evolutionary biology. The new field of research would, over the next few decades, split into many different disciplines as evolution became more widely accepted. Many scientists looked to develop Darwin's ideas. One such person was one of his own cousins, Francis Galton. Galton was fascinated by his cousin's work and sought out to research variation in human development. He started to look at different aspects of human variation, covering anything from mental ability to height and from facial images to fingerprint patterns. Galton combined Darwin's theory of evolution with the concept of heredity to develop his new idea. The concept of genes came from Gregor Mendel's when, in 1865, the basic laws of heredity were discovered. His experiments with peas showed that each physical trait was the result of a combination of two units and could be passed from one generation to another. Galton, upon discovering the obvious variations across human population, wanted to see if defects or attributes are hereditary, passed from parent to child. For this work, a monumental amount of data was needed to be able to correlate any characteristic within individuals. This would lead to his 1869 book, Hereditary Genius, an inquiry into its laws and consequences. During the research for the book, Galton looked into who he described as successful men in a given profession. He surmised that their sons were more likely to achieve such eminence themselves than if they were not closely related to eminent individuals. Basically saying that successful people have successful children. From this, Galton theorised that it was evidence for genetic transmission of human intelligence. During his research for the book, he showed that the numbers of eminent relatives dropped off when going from first degree to the second degree relatives, and from second degree to the third. The book gained praise from his peers, including his cousin Darwin. But the work had limited appeal outside of the scientific community. He thought that the most desirable traits in humans were transmitted through heredity, and thus thought that selective breeding could achieve improvement of the race, where high-achieving children be nurtured and given a good education, and once old enough, encouraged to marry with another high-achieving partner. He also stated where the better sort of immigrants and refugees from other lands were invited and welcomed, and their descendants naturalised. As for the lower achieving people, he stated that less desirable people could find a welcome and refuge in celibate monasteries or sisterhoods. This would become a theme for later eugenicists. Next, Galton looked into finding out if his theory of nature over nurture was true, and to do so, he envisioned studying twins that had been separated at birth. As if raised in different families with different social and economic backgrounds, would this affect the intelligence of each sibling? He used questionnaires to collect data and published it in an 1875 paper, The History of Twins, in which he used to test his nature over nurture hypothesis. His next book would coin the actual term eugenics. Although this was his first use of the word, as seen in Hereditary Genius, Galton had already been developing its main tenets, but had yet to name it. His book, Inquiries into Human Faculty and its Development, would first use the term eugenics, which opened up saying, "This book's intention is to touch on various topics, more or less connected with that of a cultivation of race, or as we might call it, eugenic questions, and to present the results of several of my own separate investigations." He devised a plan that would give marks for a person's preferable family traits, and as such, that society should reward early marriage between families of high rank via provision of monetary incentives. In his book, he pointed out the tendency of British high society of late marriages between eminent people, which resulted in less of an average physical size of their children. Galton did not suggest any particular selection method, but instead hoped that society would naturally favour breeding desirable couples with the help of financial incentives. He would flesh out his term definition in his 1908 book, Memories of My Life, stating that the official definition of eugenics as the study of agencies under social control that may improve or impair the racial qualities of future generations, either physically or mentally. The field still focused on selective breeding, much like with animals, through the means of financial encouragement. These ideas did not particularly take off in Galton's native UK, but they did in other parts of the world, most notably in the United States in the early stages of the 20th century. But before we look across the pond, let's summarise Galton's idea. It is split into two parts, positive and negative eugenics. The former being the promotion of good traits through encouragement of high-achieving individuals having children, and the latter being discouraging people with undesirable traits such as mental illnesses or any other handicap from having children. This second form of the theory would be the claimed justification for multiple human rights issues and ultimately genocide. Now let's look at the propagation of the field in the early 20th century. We'll come back to something I mentioned earlier, Mendel's law. By the late 1800s, this theory was largely lost to obscurity. However, in the 1890s, botanists Hugo de Vries and Carl Correns simultaneously and apparently unaware of each other rediscovered heredity, which in turn independently verified Mendel's theory almost 40 years earlier, leading to the rediscovery of Mendel's paper in 1900. This brings into the picture William Bateson, an English biologist. Inspired by the works of both Darwin and Galton, he set out to further the study of heredity, and in 1894, in unawareness of Mendel's work, released his book, Materials for the Study of Variation. Bateson, upon the rediscovery of Mendel's work, started to popularise the concept of Mendelian inheritance, even coining the term genetics in the early 1900s. Now that was a slight diversion, but it does play into eugenics and its importation into the US. Charles Davenport was a prominent biologist in the late 19th century. Throughout his studies, he gained a respect for Galton and his theories on encouraging the British elite to reproduce more. After the rediscovery and subsequent promotion of Mendelian inheritance, Davenport would seek to put these new discoveries into practice. Davenport was not the only one to embrace eugenics. Stanford president David Starr Jordan originated the notion of race and blood in his 1902 racial epistle, Blood of a Nation, in which the university scholar declared that human qualities and conditions such as talent and poverty were passed through the blood. In 1904, Davenport became the director of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. From there, he began a series of investigations into human mental and personality traits that have been inherited. 6 years after working at Spring Harbor, Davenport started the Eugenics Record Office, a research institute that collected biological and social information about the American population, serving as a centre for eugenics and human hereditary research. What was dark about the ERO was that family pedigrees were recorded, and it provided training for eugenics field workers who were sent to analyse individuals in various institutions, such as mental hospitals and orphanage institutions across the United States, essentially making a list of who the ERO deemed should be allowed to have children, and conversely, who should not be allowed to have children. The institute had a Harry H. Laughlin as its director. We will come back to him in a little bit. Eugenic legislation began in the USA, with Indiana becoming the first state to enact sterilization legalization in 1907, followed by California and Washington in 1909. Davenport would release in 1911 one of his most famous books, Heredity in Relation to Eugenics, and this writing would be a massive influence on the early 20th century eugenics movement. The book posited that many human traits were genetically inherited, and that it would therefore be possible to selectively breed people for desirable traits to improve the human race. So much was the success of the book that it was used as a text for medical schools. In the early days of the American eugenics movement, a number of financial backers sought to support Davenport by funding several foundations. One such was the Race Betterment Foundation, created in 1914 by John Harvey Kellogg. Does that name sound familiar? Well, if you've ever been down a cereal aisle of a supermarket, then you'll know what I mean. And yes, it's the same person. The foundation was created from Kellogg's fears of what he perceived as race degeneracy. Davenport also found funding from the Carnegie Institution, Rockefeller Foundation, and the Harriman Railroad Fortune. In 1911, the Carnegie Institution supported a preliminary report of the Committee of the Eugenic Selection of the American Breeders Association to study and report on the best practical means for cutting off the defective germ plasm of the human population. The report had 18 points, and number 8 was euthanasia. Along with the money came political power and many willing ears within American high society. At around the same time, Henry Herbert Goddard, a prominent American psychologist, was also working with eugenics-based theories. He was one of the first proponents of the IQ test and was the first to translate intelligence test into English. Goddard was fascinated with intelligence within the population and pushed for most US institutions to incorporate IQ testing. Throughout his career, he helped develop the new topic of clinical psychology, with positives, such as in 1911, helping to write the first US law requiring the blind, deaf and intellectually disabled children be provided special education within the public school system. He also argued that subnormal intelligence should limit criminal responsibility of defendants. But like many in this video, his ideas also had a darker side. In 1910, he advocated the labelling of subjects linked to their IQ, using the terms moron for those with an IQ of 51 to 70, imbecile for those with an IQ of 26 to 50, and idiot for those with an IQ of 0 to 25, for categories of increasing impairment. These labels would stay in mental health treatment for many years to come and become part of the English lexicon. If you've ever called someone a moron, well, this is where it came from. He went further, advocating for people who fell into his moron category and below to be segregated from society, as to not allow them to have children. As part of his intelligence testing program, he established exams on Ellis Island to find, in his word, feeble-minded immigrants. Interestingly, these tests would only be given to third-class passengers. Back in London, a new eugenics organisation was founded in 1912, named the Permanent International Eugenics Committee. It was a continuation of the First International Eugenics Congress. Interestingly, the first Congress was presided over Leonard Darwin, Charles Darwin's son, at the University of London, and was a global venue for scientists, politicians and social leaders to plan and discuss the application of programs to improve human heredity in the early 20th century. In 1921, the committee arranged for a second meeting of the International Eugenics Congress to take place at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. This time, Alexandra Graham Bell was the honorary president, further adding to the famous names to the eugenics list. It focused on issues including human heredity, race differences, regulation of reproduction, and eugenics. You see, eugenics found more fertile ground in the USA. There was a fear that non-Anglo-Saxon people were genetically inferior, and thus water down the gene pool. Obviously this is untrue, but eugenics was the vehicle in which racist ideologies could travel. Harry Laughlin, the director of the Eugenics Record Office, had become a pushing force in various eugenics-based legislation throughout the USA. In the early 1920s, Laughlin looked to further the number of states with compulsory sterilisation laws, as well as increase the numbers of sterilisations amongst the states that had enacted legislation. In Laughlin's mind, the current laws were poorly written, allowing states to employ sterilisation with less vigour than he would have liked. In a way to improve this stumbling block, Laughlin drafted a model eugenic sterilisation law to help things along better, which was published in his 1922 book, Eugenical Sterilisation in the United States. Although I won't read out the full model here, Laughlin included the following conditions that should result in compulsory sterilisation: the feeble-minded, the insane, criminals, epileptics, alcoholics, blind persons, deaf persons, deformed persons, and indigent persons. By the 1960s, Laughlin's model was responsible for 64,000 individuals being forcibly sterilised under eugenic legislation in the United States. The law would be used as the basis for the law of the prevention of hereditary diseased offspring, the 1933 Nazi legislation that would ultimately result in 400,000 people being sterilised against their will. But Laughlin's exploits didn't just end with sterilisation laws. He was also used for extensive statistical testimony to the United States Congress in support of the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act of 1924. This law limited immigration to the United States from Asia and set quotas on the number of immigrants from the Eastern Hemisphere. Internally in the US, a number of states also brought in eugenics-inspired marriage laws forbidding weddings between people of different races, such as Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924. After the 1921 Eugenics Congress, the Permanent International Eugenics Committee was retitled in 1925 to International Federation of Eugenics Organizations, bringing in future Nazi Eugen Fischer, and this is where our story takes a turn into scientific racism. Davenport, in 1922, attempted to prove the dangers of interracial relationships with his book Race Crossing in Jamaica. The book gained wide ridicule, as the conclusions within stretched far beyond the data provided, and in some cases even contradicted it. The eugenics movement in the US would peak in the 1930s with policies of both positive and negative eugenic implementations, with fitter families contests awarding medals to eugenically sound families, more states implementing sterilisation laws, and ever popular eugenic advertisements being commonplace. A disproportionately higher number of women of African and Native American backgrounds were forcibly sterilised under the laws written with Lauchlin's model. Scarily, who was seen as genetically inferior was down to the flawed and racist thinking that non-whites had a higher chance of bearing children with mental and physical defects. Women in general were targeted with more of these laws, resulting in roughly 61% of all eugenic sterilisations being performed on women. So much so was the influence of the US eugenics movement that the methods for eugenics-based discrimination would be imported back to Europe, and a new hateful political ideology building up in Germany. Much like the rest of Europe in the early 20th century, eugenics was deemed by many German scientists as a legitimate study. The eugenics programs followed very closely the lead of the US, and once the Nazis got into power in 1933, the discrimination went into overtime. German eugenics was split between two types of thinking. The more moderate Wilhelm Schallmayer, who rejected the race element in the field, but his version of the study would be by the 1930s be drowned out by Alfred Polet and his more racist view of eugenics. He was a proponent of the cruel racial hygiene movement, which he published in his 1895 book, Racial Hygiene Basics. In 1933, he was put on to the Expert Advisory Committee for Population and Racial Policy. This was tasked to advise the Nazi Party on how to best implement eugenic and racial hygiene policies. And this brings us back to Lauchlin's model of compulsory sterilisation and its implementation in the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring. This would put alleged cases of hereditary illness up in front of a genetic health court. Hitler, in private, expressed his interest in pushing the program towards euthanasia, but stopped short of implementing it during peacetime. But as Germany started rearming and setting its sights on war, the policy would be brought in. In 1939, a trial case of euthanasia was used in the murder of 5-month-old Gerhard Kretschmer, who was blind as well as having physical and developmental difficulties. The murder was undertaken by Karl Bandt, one of Hitler's personal physicians. 3 weeks after Gerhard's murder, the Reich Committee for the Scientific Registering of Heredity and Congenital Illnesses was created to register sick or newborns identified as defective. In October 1939, Adolf Hitler signed the Euthanasia Note, backdated to the 1st of September 1939, which authorised his physician Karl Bandt and Reichssteller Bühler to begin the euthanasia program, which post-war would be called Action T4. Germany had taken negative eugenics to a whole new level, seeing Darwinism as justification for the demand for beneficial genes and the eradication of the harmful ones. A number of physicians were authorised to decide which patients under their care would be deemed incurably sick, and then euthanise the victim. The list of conditions acceptable for murder included, but wasn't limited to, schizophrenia, epilepsy, Huntington's chorea, advanced syphilis, senile dementia, paralysis, and terminal neurological conditions generally. Between 1939 and the fall of the Nazi regime in 1945, an estimated 300,000 people were murdered throughout Germany, occupied Poland, Austria, and the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. This number included infant children, women, and men. Various execution methods were experimented with, from lethal injection administered by a medical practitioner to the first implementation of poisonous gas for large groups of victims. The first such instance, in January 1940, was at the Brandenburg Euthanasia Centre. So much so were the Nazis impressed with the use of gas in the extermination activities during the Action T4 programme that it was expanded to an industrial scale for the Holocaust. As the war in Europe ended with Allied victory, the realities of the eugenics-based racial and social discrimination became public knowledge in the US and UK. The Doctors' Nuremberg trials and the euthanasia trials highlighted the terrifying outcome of eugenic ideas, and thus the field fell out of favour. In the wake of the horrors of Nazi Germany, formalised policies of medical ethics and the 1950s UNESCO Statement on Race came into force. Several eugenic societies would back their definitions from the field, although forced sterilisations would continue into the 1960s, with it peaking in the 1950s. Eugenicists pushed more towards federal-funded birth control measures after the invention of the pill for their deemed undesirable groups, such as ethnic minorities and the poor. But the field couldn't shake off its links to the Nazis, and as such, many societies hemorrhaged members. In 1959, a special meeting of Britain's Eugenics Society discussed ways to stop losses in membership, including the suggestion that the society should pursue eugenic ends by less obvious means, by the policy of crypto-eugenics, which was apparently proving successful with the US Eugenics Society. Many eugenicists went underground, pursuing other careers, with many new fields of study being influenced by eugenics. Prominent eugenicist Paul Popenoe founded marriage counselling during the 1950s. He grew the subject from his eugenic interest in promoting healthy marriages between fit couples. Much of the eugenics-based policies were overruled during the civil rights movement, thankfully eradicating the racist and ableist abuse imposed by the government. However, as time has moved on, some eugenic ideas have become possible, but instead of coercion and abuse, modern science has allowed isolation of certain genes. This, of course, is through genetic screening, and although controversial, it bypasses the horrors of negative eugenics. There are still many modern proponents of eugenics-backed societies. One such was the Genius Sperm Bank, which ran between 1980 and 1999, created by Robert Clark Graham. This bank was responsible for around 230 children conceived with sperm from high-achieving donors, of which some were Nobel Prize winners. But more than anything else, the field of eugenics produced some of the darkest outcomes of the 20th century. These ideas helped create division within societies, become the justification for genocide, and led many away from compassion, which should be the mark of a successful society. I wonder if Darwin could have ever envisioned the horrors that had taken inspiration from his work when he took those long strolls around the grounds of Down House. I know this has been a very dark and sad, as well as a long video, but I've only just scratched the surface.
Some of those insights that you think our movement has missed in that regard.
Well, you know, you mentioned LBJ and the Great Society. I would actually go much earlier than that. Let's start with capital P progressivism at the turn of the century, which was eugenicist. You know, this is something we downplay too much in our education system. This is a movement that believed in a pseudoscientific concept of race, put blacks at the bottom of that, and decided that in modern life, this is capital P progressivism, right? In modern life, life is too complicated, and so we have to put experts in charge. And what the experts are going to do is they're going to decide how to support the white Aryan male head of household and how to let other groups fade away. What was one of their ideas to do that? The minimum wage. And this is totally explicit. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's right there in the economics textbooks. This is how we're going to disemploy the undesirables and allow them to fade away. You saw that theme of eugenicism then picked up in the Federal Housing Administration, who was trying to control who lived where. They didn't want to extend mortgage insurance to Black neighborhoods or to integrated neighborhoods. They wanted Black and white people to live apart, et cetera. And so you see these ideas playing out very, very early, actually. Yeah. And what's interesting is that it's from the progressive side, right?
What was interesting to me is your point about the minimum wage. I actually wasn't aware of that. So historically, the logic that most ordinary listeners or Americans might have about the minimum wage is that it's designed to say that, hey, the workers who earn it deserve to be paid a higher price than they are today. And a lot of what you've seen empirically is that that results in fewer people being employed, because if a company or an employer has a budget relative to apply to their labor force, then you're going to have fewer people hired for that budget relative to what would have been hired if they were able to hire the lowest wage person. But your point is that was actually part of the point. And I think that's interesting. What's the evidence for that?
Yeah, there's a wonderful book called Illiberal Reformers, which I highly recommend, where he goes through people like Kellogg, great economists, arguing in textbooks that were used across the country in 1906, 1908, saying, look, and I hate to even use this quote because it's so disgusting, but they said things like, since we can't chloroform them now, we can disemploy them by raising wages to such an extent that no one will hire them at that rate. So if you're someone who speaks a different language, who maybe the other employees don't like so much, right? Someone with a disability, et cetera, you will be disemployed by this high minimum wage. It was incredibly popular. And we have to remind people how popular eugenics was. John Maynard Keynes, Woodrow Wilson, so many cabinet members of presidential cabinets were on the boards of eugenics associations. This was a very popular movement in the United States and Europe.
And this isn't like a long time ago for people. We're talking about like 1 century ago, 100 years ago in the United States or less.
Yeah.
So say a little bit more about Keynes and Wilson. I think this is a side of their history that we don't necessarily oft remember. This is fascinating to me. When you say eugenics, I mean, that's a loaded word, right? What do you exactly mean? What were the views that they espoused or advanced? And just be specific about which groups of people they were talking about, in a way that we would find offensive today.
Yeah, sure. At this time, actually, Eastern Europeans were a huge target, as well as African Americans, and particularly the disabled. We should never forget how they were included. Keynes wrote a letter to Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, in which he said, now that we've solved the quantity problem, we have to move on to the quality problem. And he was talking about human beings. Keynes considered eugenics to be the zenith of modern science. This was what we're going to do next to create a utopian world.
If this was predicted 27 years ago, somebody knew something. Okay, here's the list. This is an abbreviated list. I could have made it much longer. You know I can. I didn't. Okay, you ready for the list? Fast mutating viral disease pandemics. Genetically developed vaccines. Smart IDs. 1997! I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scream, but, just make sure none of you are nodding off, because the eyes get heavy and... DNA database tracking. DNA chips. Get this one. 1997, gene-based pharmaceuticals. Transmitting genetic instructions for a disease process. How about this one? You ready for it? Wait for it. Artificial intelligence to determine gene patterns. 27 years ago, Who had heard about AI? Apparently they had. How about this one? Robots for doing genome sequencing. And then this one blew me away. Using recombinant DNA for making spike proteins. 1997? It gets even worse. Smart homes. They have a whole chapter on smart homes / smart cities. This one will absolutely floor you. It did me. In 1997, and this is, you can do the word search and research yourself. They predicted not 2025, but by 2020, that people would be working from home virtually. Ah, come on. Listen, that's, you know. I mean, how do you know that? Because you're the one who did that. World War III, of course. Nuclear devices causing widespread contamination. Nano-Tech devices. This stuff was never even heard of. Digital currency. And last but certainly not least, vaccination programs. I'm sorry, I got to chuckle, because if I don't, I'll cry. Vaccination programs run by organizations like the World Health Organization for a global killer that has yet to emerge. First printing, February 1997. If this was predicted 27 years ago, somebody knew something.
Haben Sie jemals an einer Entwicklung eines Impfstoffes gearbeitet, der letztendlich auch an die Öffentlichkeit kam? Ja. Welcher? Nun ja, es waren Impfstoffe gegen Röteln, Rotavirus, Tollwut. Und hier und da habe ich bei Milzbrand mit beigetragen. Zytomegalovirus, Virus Ella. Zu Ihrer Arbeit bezüglich Impfstoffen. Wie viele Föten wurden dafür verwendet? Meine eigene Arbeit? 2. Ich gebe Ihnen hier mal, was als Beweismittel Nummer 41 markiert wurde. Sind Sie mit diesem Artikel vertraut, Dr. Blotkin? Ja. Sind Sie als Autor dieses Artikels aufgelistet? Ja. Diese Studie wurde am Vista-Institut durchgeführt, korrekt? Ja. Sie waren am Vista-Institut? Ja. Wie viele Föten wurden in der beschriebenen Studie aus dem Artikel genutzt? Schon einige. Also diese Studie umfasste 74 Föten, korrekt? Ich erinnere mich nicht, wie viele es genau waren. Blättern Sie zur Seite 12 der Studie. Nun ja, 76. 76. Und diese Föten waren alle 3 Monate alt oder älter, als sie abgetrieben wurden, korrekt? Ja. Und das waren alle ganz normal entwickelte Föten, korrekt? Ja. Welche Organe haben Sie von diesen Föten abgeerntet? Nun ja, ich selbst habe keine entnommen. Aber es wurde eine ganze Reihe von Geweben von Mitarbeitern abgeerntet. Und diese Stücke wurden dann in kleinere zerteilt, richtig? Ja. Und sie wurden gezüchtet? Ja. Okay, und manche dieser Stücke der Föten waren Hirnanhangsdrüsen und diese wurden dann in weitere Stücke gehackt? Mhm. Einschließlich die Lungen der Föten? Ja. Auch die Haut? Ja. Nieren? Ja. Milz? Ja. Herz? Ja. Und Zunge? Ich erinnere mich nicht genau, aber vermutlich ja. Also ich will nur sicherstellen, dass ich es verstehe. In Ihrer ganzen Karriere war diese hier nur eine Studie. Lassen Sie mich diese Frage nochmal stellen. Mit wie vielen Föten haben Sie in Ihrer ganzen Karriere gearbeitet? Nun, ich erinnere mich nicht an die exakte Zahl, aber schon einige, als wir erst noch an ihnen geforscht haben, bevor wir uns überhaupt dafür entschieden, sie für Impfstoffe zu nutzen. Ich meine, diese einzelne Studie hat 76. Wie viele andere Studien hatten Sie, in denen Sie eine ganze Tafel an Föten nutzen? Und oh, ich weiß nicht mehr wie viele. Ist Ihnen bewusst, dass einer der Einwände des Klägers gegen Impfung, in diesem Fall, die Einbeziehung von abgetriebenem fötalem Gewebe in der Entwicklung von Impfstoffen ist und der Fakt, dass es tatsächlich eines der Inhaltsstoffe von ihnen ist? Ja, diese Einwände sind mir bewusst. Die katholische Kirche hat übrigens ein Dokument ausgestellt, in dem steht, dass Individuen, die den Impfstoff brauchen sollen, ihn auch erhalten, ungeachtet des Fakts, dass und ich denke, es impliziert, dass ich das Individuum bin, das zur Hölle fahren wird, wegen dem Gebrauch von abgetriebenem Gewebe. Und ich werde es gerne tun. Wissen Sie, ob die Mütter katholisch sind? Keine Ahnung. Widersprechen Sie religiösen Ansichten? Ja. Sie sagten, Zitat, dass Impfung immer von religiösen Fanatikern attackiert wird, die glauben, dass der Wille Gottes Tod und Krankheiten beinhaltet. Ja, stehen Sie noch zu diesem Statement? Das tue ich absolut. Sind Sie Atheist? Ja.
We've all been waiting for it to happen. Just didn't know how it was going to rear its ugly head.
What? The New World Order.
Population reduction.
Is that what you and Lily were filming?
Yeah. We were filming in case anything happens to us.
Tell me.
There's no going back from this, Leon. Everything will change for you once you know.
Tell me.
I believe we are enslaved in a society where we will not be free to think or feel or do anything other than consume. Slaves for work to buy things beyond our means. Living in fear of terrorism. I believe this is to blindside us, trick us into a situation where they, the powers that be, will wipe us out. Kill most of us. Kill all of us here. They are going to reduce the population. That is what I believe.
It's sad to think that there may need to be a population limit on the Earth. Maybe there does. We can't keep on doing what we're doing.
There will be a global population reduction until there are only 500 million people there. Although I believe that this planet can support 2 billion humans perfectly. How do you know that?
It's a question of space and the resources that space has. And using those resources to survive and not exploiting them.
Almost 7 billion humans use too many resources. This leads to a very uncertain future for us all.
Right, climate change.
Climate change occurs naturally. That's why we have the Ice Age.
So now you're telling me that climate change is fake?
As you know it.
Why do you recycle? Why do you recycle?
I'm doing my bit.
So you're trying to save the planet?
Yeah.
how precious of you to think that you could save the planet. If she needed saving, especially from us, she'd just wipe us out. Hypothetically, if we want to conserve 80% of the planet's resources, then we should get rid of or cull that 20% of the population who are consuming them, yeah?
Hypothetically, I guess that would be a solution.
Yeah, the final solution.
We use so much of the planet's resources that there's just no balance. Soon we would have depleted the resources so much that life can't be sustained. And then everything will die.
How would they reduce the population? We're not stupid.
Hitler said, the bigger the lie, the more the people will believe it.
I think it would be done Hitler style. The armed forces are going to kill us. They'll follow orders. It's what they've been trained to do. They're being taught to be racists. The army are already killing people in other countries. People in power are using fear to fuel the racism. How long before they use this racism to make soldiers turn on their own? Innocent people living in a police state.
So had it begun, controlling and monitoring the movement of individuals within the society, putting chips in passports, ID cards, CCTV.
They're using this orchestrated ruse to convince the public to accept Big Brother-type controls. And then they will intentionally reduce the mass of the world's population. Mass genocide on a scale never seen before. There are a mass of ways they could introduce population slaughter. More staged events, orchestrated and maneuvered conflicts, and the use of bioengineered diseases. Vaccines. It could come in vaccines. Women are being encouraged to get sterilized. What if they're using cervical cancer jabs? Not this generation, but the next. Prevention and cure for cancer. Or having babies.
It's madness.
You're right. They'd never wait 2 generations.
In the event that I am reincarnated, I'd like to come back as a deadly virus. So as to contribute to solving overpopulation. Prince Philip said that. Bioengineered pathogens are being created to eliminate ethnic groups, such as blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans, homosexuals.
Homosexuals? Surely that would keep the population down.
Yes, but it's not nature's way. Love is not a factor when you're dealing with how the few procreate.
Natural selection, where the only natural element is the powers that be.
Population control already happens in China. You have to have a license before you can have a second child.
Come on, Dion. How many times have you thought about how unfair it is that you have to work to have a good life, whereas others breed and get given benefits and homes? How often have you wondered, like many others, what real value they bring to the world?
Population reduction programs eliminate a mind-blowing 95% of the population.
Eugenics is the pseudoscience culling the excess population.
Fake science.
Got that.
Who was a clever girl?
It'll be done in a barbaric fashion using draconian methods, and this global holocaust will probably come out from under the flag of the UN.
I can almost imagine us being frog-marched away from our homes in a martial law kind of way. And no one bats an eyelid.
Almost 95% of the population.
13 out of every 14 people killed, destroyed, and murdered.
In order to stabilize world population, they need, or want, to dispose of 6.5 billion people.
Viewers, you don't know who the cameraman is.
No.
You don't know why you're being made to see these things. Nor do I. You're seeing me. I can't even see you. I may be dead by the time you watch this. Very possibly are. You don't know who's the man who's making things he wants you to see. Destroy your television sets. Now. You must listen to no orders. That's all I can tell you at this point in humanity. Brilliant.
Wait. What?
In etwa 200 Jahren, um eine vorsichtige Schätzung abzugeben, wird es auf dem Planeten Erde kein Homo sapiens mehr geben.
200 Jahre.
200 Jahre, das ist eine konservative Schätzung.
Wow.
Wow. Vielleicht 100 Jahre. Wir zerstören uns nicht selbst durch eine Katastrophe. Viel wahrscheinlicher ist, dass wir fortschrittliche Technologien, Biotechnologie, Nanotechnologie und direkte Gehirn-Computerschnittstellen nutzen werden, um den Homo sapiens in andere Lebewesen zu verwandeln. Wesen, die sich von uns viel mehr unterscheiden, als wir uns vom Neandertaler unterscheiden. Wesen, die andere Körper, andere Geister und andere Gehirne haben werden. Ich meine, die großen Produkte des kommenden Jahrhunderts werden nicht Schuhe, Kleidung, Autos oder Waffen sein. Das große Produkt des 21. Jahrhunderts werden Körper und Geist sein. Ich glaube also, dass wir auf eine Aufwertung des Homo sapiens zu einem Gott zusteuern. Ich werde die natürliche Selektion durch intelligentes Design ersetzen. Besonders in den USA gibt es diesen großen Streit zwischen natürlicher Selektion und intelligentem Design. Und das Lustige, das Ironische daran ist, dass die Leute, die an die natürliche Selektion glauben, meiner Meinung nach in Bezug auf die Vergangenheit offensichtlich recht haben. Die Menschen, die an Intelligent Design glauben, haben mit ihrer Einschätzung der Zukunft recht. Die Zukunft des Lebens gehört dem intelligenten Design. Aber die Designer, die intelligenten Designer, werden keine Götter über den Wolken sein. Wir werden die intelligenten Gestalter der Zukunft des Lebens im Universum sein.
We're taking things that are, genetically modified organisms and we're injecting them in little kids' arms. We just shoot them right into the vein.
Es geht darum, dass in Covid-19-Impfstoffen, den mRNA-Impfstoffen, auch DNA gefunden worden ist. Das heißt, das 10- bis 100-fache, was geeignet ist dazu, das menschliche Erbgut zu verändern, also den Menschen genetisch zu verändern.
Und Sie haben in diesem Zusammenhang Dokumente zugespielt bekommen. Was sagen nun diese Dokumente genau?
Ich bin von einem Mitarbeiter der slowakischen Regierung gebeten worden, diese Dokumente anzuschauen. Sogar die umgekehrten Mengen von mRNA und DNA gefunden worden ist. Das heißt, es war mehr DNA als mRNA in diesen Impfstoffen. Uns wurde ja immer gesagt, nein, in diesen Impfstoffen sei nur halt mRNA, also einsträngige Erbinformation da und das würde nicht in das menschliche Erbgut eingebaut werden, was man dann als DNA bezeichnet. Tatsächlich haben wir aber jetzt staatlich gefunden, dass tatsächlich große Mengen DNA in den Impfstoffen drin sind und sogar in so großen Mengen, dass sie sogar die mRNA eben sogar noch übertreffen. Das ist ein weltweiter Skandal. Wir können nicht sagen, was es tatsächlich auslöst, denn die Programmierung von DNA, da kann ja nur derjenige, der es programmiert hat, das bestimmen. Programmierer der Firma Microsoft sich gerühmt haben, dass sie DNA programmieren können. Und sie sagten selber in die Kamera, das habe ich gezeigt, dass sie gesagt haben, sie können komplexes menschliches Verhalten programmieren damit.
Rather than through anything we carry in our pocket. And in that way, wirelessly, we can basically download entire books, entire languages, and we will then know these things just by the act of downloading.
Well, that's one implication.
Into our brains.
But we'll have more neocortex, so we won't be limited to a mere 300 million pattern modules. We'll have billions or 10 billion.
What, biologically, or just simply because we have these nanobots?
We'll have this extension that's non-biological.
Scientists predict the outbreak of at least 37 viruses which are capable of annihilating humanity. Flu strains will mutate rapidly and start affecting the human nervous system and DNA. Moreover, those viruses will be resistant to any type of drugs known today.
But we've got something that might help. A pill to cure all diseases has been invented.
And this technology could actually help you live up to 150 years. This is a laboratory in Krasnoyarsk. Here, robot technicians create microscopic robots which will be able to live in our bodies and treat diseases. There are millions of them on this plate. Are you ready to see them? Here is what a nanodisc looks like. It's so tiny that 50,000 of these put in a row are still thinner than a human hair. Each disc consists of gold and nickel layers and contains a biologically active molecule. Today, this white rat is our patient. Our rat is put into a device with a magnetic field, which helps to operate nanodiscs. The magnetic field to operate nanodiscs.
A company based in Boston, they've just created what they believe to be the first potential coronavirus vaccine. Obviously this won't be available on the market for months. However, I have suspicions and curiosities regarding the vaccine, the potential for a vaccine for coronavirus or for COVID-19, and the possibility that inside that medicine, inside that vaccine, or used to create that vaccine, nanobots, nanomites, basically nano-robotics. You can see in the images on the screen how small they are, down to the size of a red blood cell and smaller. Now, in my interpretation, if these nanobots are injected into the bloodstream, and they're the things that are responsible for making people better, obviously people are gonna, they're not gonna know it's nanotechnology, but the vaccine is gonna work just to the masses. That's how it's gonna look. The vaccine is going to work, so a lot of people are gonna get it. Now, after the virus has been cured by the nanobots, they don't leave the system. They stay within the body and can in fact, collect somewhere in the body and just sit there waiting for what? The final thing, 5G. Now we know that they started releasing this 5th generation wireless technology in 2019, and we're going to have a wide rollout throughout 2020. Now, I feel that the 5G technology could be used to send commands to those nanobots, that if the vaccine contains nanobots or nanorobotics, and those robots.
Das US-Patent 2022002159A1. Graphenoxid-Nanopartikel zur Wolkenimpfung. Ihr wisst schon, Wolkenimpfung, die Flugzeuge, die dann irgendwas hinten aussprühen, ne? Ist ja mittlerweile gang und gäbe. Chemtrails ist natürlich nicht das richtige Wort dafür, man sagt jetzt Wolkenimpfung. Ne? Klingt ja nett, ne? Ist ja nur zu unserem Besten, ne? Dass man da ein bisschen das Wetter manipuliert, hat aber auch nichts mit dem Klimawandel zu tun und so. Wie auch immer, lasst mich auf das Patent eingehen. Ich lese vor. Die vorliegende Erfindung betrifft ein Eiskernbildungspartikel für die Wolkenimpfung und andere Anwendungen, das bei einer Temperatur von -8 Grad Celsius Eisbildung auslösen kann. Darüber hinaus steigt die Anzahl der Eiskernbildungspartikel mit sinkender Temperatur kontinuierlich und schnell an. Das Eiskernbildungspartikel der vorliegenden Erfindung ist ein nanostrukturiertes, poröses Komposit aus dreidimensionalen, reduzierten Graphenoxid- und Siliziumdioxid-Nanopartikeln. Yo! Und wer sich schon ein bisschen über die Piekser von 2020-2021 informiert hat, der hat sicherlich schon mal das Wort Graphenoxid gehört. Das Zeug, das laut diesem Patent über unseren Köpfen ausgeschüttet werden soll. Herrlich. In dieser Studie von 2019 werden die Gefahren von Graphenoxid aufgelistet. Ich fasse mal kurz zusammen. Es verursacht Thrombosen, es verursacht Blutgerinnsel, es zerstört das Immunsystem, es ist in den Fasern der Kunststoffmasken enthalten, es ist in jedem Covid-19-Impfstoff enthalten, Hashtag Long-Covid, es kann zu Lungenentzündungen führen, es kann die Schleimhäute entzünden, es führt zu einem Verlust des Geschmacks- und Geruchssinns, es ist magnetisch, besonders an der Injektionsstelle, es blockiert die Entgiftung im Körper, indem es Glutation blockiert, es durchschlägt die Blut-Hirn-Schranke, es kann von 5G-Frequenzen aktiviert werden. Ich möchte einen Satz aus diesem Artikel hier zitieren. Graphenoxid kann also als alleiniger Auslöser für die meisten Covid-Symptome wirken. Es handelt sich dabei nicht um ein Virus oder Spike-Protein, sondern um einen chemischen Kampfstoff. Eingereicht wurde dieses Patent von der Khalifa University of Science and Technology aus Abu Dhabi.
Chemtrails. And chemtrails, by the way, barium salts are in chemtrails. They are 10,000 times more toxic to your nervous system than lead. They contain mycobacteria, viruses, Pseudomonas florensis bacteria, human plasma, Wonder what human plasma is doing in chemtrails. And this is not by conjecture. I did a lot of research before I'd ever say this, but these chemtrails are nasty. And there's 3 reasons for chemtrails. The first is and I talked to my NSA buddies at Fort Carson, Peterson Air Force Base, and Buckley, where I was actually their doctor taking care of the pilots flying and spraying the chemtrails. So I know it's real. If anybody says it's not real, they're full of it. Okay, because I'm a whistleblower. On the inside, it's not open for discussion. And my NSA buddies told me, 95% of them told me, they were up there trying to spray to reflect the sun out to stop global warming. So most of them are dumb enough to believe that garbage. Okay? And also in the chemtrails, and there's a link directly that Jeff Francis found out, and I'm going to have Dr. Staninger and Dr. Carjou on in about a week on my radio show. And I've done some investigations, and there's very solid evidence now that Morgellons is caused by a silicon-based nanomachine life form that does not originate on planet Earth. Is that not interesting? This is a silicon-based life form that is intelligent like bees or ants, and it fights back. Conversion of the atmosphere into a plasma for weather modification, geotectonic warfare, scalar mind control technologies, the woodpecker, which has been discovered back in the 70s, HARP, the Tetra system in the United Kingdom, Gwen towers in the United States, and the Iridium satellite system connected to the cell towers and the smart highways is all based on not only sending out a signal to track you, but Nokia, which is one of the leading cell companies, has figured out a new way to cut down the need for increasing the amount of signal by 3 to 5 times as many cell phones in the same signal area by beaming the signal directly to you. But they can also, besides the cell signal, they can actually have a biocoded signal to your DNA to affect your physiology and insert thoughts into your mind. And they have this technology today.
Smart Dust. Die neue Technologie könnte es bald möglich machen, alles und jeden im Auge zu behalten. Smart Dust wurde in den 90er Jahren von DARPA entwickelt. Dieser staubkorngroße Chip von Hitachi ist das kleinste kommerziell erhältliche RFID-System der Welt. Wir können dieses Zeug buchstäblich wie Staub verstreuen und es werden keinerlei Batterien benötigt. Ein Hauch von Rechenleistung setzt sich auf deiner Haut ab, wird von deinem Körper aufgenommen und überwacht dich von innen und außen. Die Nanopartikel sind so konzipiert, dass sie unter dem Radar des Immunsystems und somit vom Körper unentdeckt bleiben. Wir haben überall Computer, Konnektivität und die nötige Infrastruktur, die diese mit den Fähigkeiten der KI berechnen kann. Wenn die Chips über genügend Daten und Rechenleistung verfügen, können sie Menschen besser verstehen, als sie sich selbst verstehen. Und dann können wir sie auf eine Art und Weise manipulieren, die vorher unmöglich war.
Can we go from Wi-Fi radio signals, sort of like the Wi-Fi routers in your house, they're bouncing off radio signals that work sort of like sonar. Can you go from that to where human beings are, to images? So what they did is they had, a camera looking at a space with people in it. That's sort of like coming in from one eye. The other eye is the radio signals, so sonar from the Wi-Fi router. And they just learned to predict, like, this is where the human beings are. Then they took away the camera. So all the AI had was the language of radio signals bouncing around a room. And this is what they're able to reconstruct. Real-time 3D pose estimation, right? So suddenly AI has turned every Wi-Fi router into a camera that can work in the dark, specially tuned for tracking living beings.
So those nanobots are kept within the human body. They could be used at a later date. 5G technology can serve a huge amount of data at the same time, which is the big difference between 3G, 4G and 5G. Obviously 5G is the fastest of the wireless networks or wireless technologies, and enables people to transfer massive amounts of data very, very quickly. So if there was a, central command, for example, one day the command is sent out.
Transmit complete.
5G technology sends the signal all around the world in, very short space of time. And all those nanobots that are collected in people's bodies come into action. 5G technology, the coronavirus, nanotechnology, this vaccine, suddenly it only took them around 40 days from sequencing to producing the vaccine, which is an incredibly fast turnaround time for vaccine production. I feel that there's more to it than just, good luck and smart people. Obviously these things are planned well in advance, so it's the possibility that, they could have been working on this vaccine for a long time. But in my opinion, the nanotechnology, the 5G technology, and the coronavirus are all linked together.
Hier ist ein TED-Vortrag, den er 2010 gehalten hat. Ein Jahr nachdem der gute Club in Manhattan zusammenkam, um über die Überbevölkerung zu sprechen. Denke darüber nach, was er jetzt hier sagt, mit den Hintergrundinformationen, die wir jetzt haben. Über 26 Milliarden Tonnen. Für jeden Amerikaner sind es etwa 20 Tonnen. Für Menschen in armen Ländern weniger als 1 Tonne. Für jeden Menschen auf der Welt sind es durchschnittlich 5 Tonnen. Und irgendwie müssen wir Veränderungen vornehmen, die das auf Null reduzieren. Es ist ständig gestiegen. Es sind nur verschiedene wirtschaftliche Veränderungen, die das Ganze sogar abgeflacht haben. Wir müssen also von einem raschen Anstieg zu einem Rückgang übergehen und bis auf Null absenken. Diese Gleichung hat 4 Faktoren. Ein wenig Multiplikation. Links sehen wir CO2, das auf Null sinken soll. Und das basiert auf der Anzahl der Personen, der Dienstleistungen, dem durchschnittlichen Verbrauch jeder Person, der durchschnittlichen Energie für jede Dienstleistung und der CO2-Ausgabe pro Energieeinheit. Schauen wir uns nun also jede einzelne davon an und sehen wir, wie wir das auf Null bringen können. Wahrscheinlich wird eine dieser Zahlen ziemlich nahe an die Nulllinie heranreichen müssen. Nun, das ist ein wenig Highschool-Algebra. Hahaha, Highschool-Algebra. Eine dieser Zahlen wird nahe an die Null herankommen müssen, nämlich Menschen. Das ist der Typ, der sich gerade ein Jahr zuvor mit George Soros getroffen hat, um über Bevölkerungskontrolle zu sprechen. Und hier sagt er nun weißt du, ihr großes Ding ist, dass CO2 den Planeten tötet. Leben Pflanzen nicht von CO2? Ich meine, gerade sollte die beste Zeit in der Geschichte des Planeten sein. Aber hier ist er, der Typ, der ein Jahr zuvor über Bevölkerungskontrolle gesprochen hat. Und er sagt jetzt, nun, da CO2 den Planeten tötet, müssen wir eines dieser Dinge absenken. Die allererste Variable in seiner kleinen mathematischen Gleichung sind die Menschen. Denk darüber nach. Hör dir jetzt an, was er sagt. Schauen wir uns das mal an. Zuerst haben wir die Bevölkerung. Jetzt hat die Welt 6,8 Milliarden Menschen, das sind bald 9 Milliarden. Wenn wir jetzt wirklich gute Arbeit bei neuen Impfstoffen, bei der Gesundheitsfürsorge und bei den Diensten der reproduktiven Gesundheit leisten, können wir diese Zahl vielleicht um 10 oder 15% senken. Wenn wir bei Impfstoffen, Gesundheitsfürsorge und reproduktiven Gesundheitsdiensten wirklich gute Arbeit leisten, können wir die Bevölkerung um 15% senken. Hören wir uns das noch einmal an. Schauen wir uns das mal an. Zuerst haben wir die Bevölkerung. Jetzt hat die Welt 6,8 Milliarden Menschen, das sind bald 9 Milliarden. Wenn wir jetzt wirklich gute Arbeit bei neuen Impfstoffen, bei der Gesundheitsfürsorge und bei den Diensten der reproduktiven Gesundheit leisten, können wir diese Zahl vielleicht um 10 oder 15% senken. Das ist genozidales Wahnsinnsgerede. 50% von 8 Milliarden, das sind 1,2 Milliarden Menschen. Das sind 200 mal 6 Millionen. 1,2 Milliarden Menschen.
1.2 billion people.
Eine andere Seuche, die sich als äußerst praktisch erwies, war die spanische Grippe. Während des Ersten Weltkriegs starben mehr Menschen an der spanischen Grippe als an Kugeln. Zwischen 1918 und 20 starben schätzungsweise 50 Millionen Menschen. 1/3 der gesamten Weltbevölkerung war infiziert. Es wird angenommen, dass es die größte Pandemie war, die die Welt je erlebt hat. Es gibt einige sehr interessante Dinge über die spanische Grippe. Erstens, sie begann nicht in Spanien. Zweitens, es war keine Grippe. Es gibt noch mehr. Aber lassen Sie uns mit diesen beiden anfangen, ja? Wenn sie nicht in Spanien begonnen hat, wo dann? In den USA. Wenn es kein Grippevirus war, was war es dann? Es war ein Bakterium, das eine schwere und in den meisten Fällen tödliche Lungenentzündung verursachte. Laut einer Studie des National Institute of Health aus dem Jahre 2008 war eine bakterielle Lungenentzündung in mindestens 92,7% der untersuchten Autopsien der Pandemie von 1918 bis 19 die Todesursache. Warum nennen wir es also die spanische Grippe? Als ein Köder, eine Nebelwand, um die Wahrheit zu verbergen. Und warum? Weil die Wahrheit so scheußlich ist, dass die meisten Menschen lieber eine bequeme Lüge hören. Die ersten Fälle von bakterieller Lungenentzündung im Jahr 1918 gehen auf eine Militärbasis in Fort Riley, Kansas zurück. Lange Rede, kurzer Sinn? In der ersten Hälfte des Jahres 1918 wurde den Soldaten in Fort Riley ein experimenteller bakterieller Meningitis-Impfstoff injiziert, der vom Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York, heute Rockefeller University, in Pferden gezüchtet wurde. Die sogenannte spanische Grippe war ein Impfstoffexperiment, das schrecklich schief ging.
Globally thinking and research and development and innovation-minded person, and therefore I'm very interested to hear what Stefan has to tell us now.
Ultimately, the mRNA vaccines are an example for that cell and gene therapy. I always like to say, if we had surveyed 2 years ago in the public, would you be willing to take gene or cell therapy and inject it into your body, we would have probably had a 95% refusal rate. I think this pandemic has also opened many people's eyes to innovation in a way that was maybe not possible before. But innovations in the field of biotech also radically upend our view on many other diseases, especially NCDs. We can now think of curing many of those diseases, not just treating symptoms, as we think forward. Innovation, and we tend to forget that, especially in the rich countries, is also sustainability at a totally different level.
Millionen von amerikanischen Soldaten wurden mit diesem experimentellen Serum geimpft. 2 Millionen von ihnen gingen nach Übersee. Sie kämpften unter schlechten hygienischen Bedingungen, sodass sich die Bakterien wie ein Lauffeuer verbreiteten, wo immer sie hinkamen. Dann wurde die Geschichte verbreitet, dass diese Soldaten mit allen möglichen europäischen Krankheiten nach Hause kommen würden. Also wurde auch die amerikanische Bevölkerung geimpft. Zu allem Überfluss wurden die Impfstoffe auch noch in ganz Europa verteilt. Nur die Geimpften starben. Gesunde Männer und Frauen in der Blüte ihres Lebens starben. Nicht die Alten, wie es bei einem Grippevirus der Fall gewesen wäre. Wer war für dieses Verteilungs- und Massenimpfungsprogramm verantwortlich? Das Rockefeller-Institut. Wer war der verantwortliche Wissenschaftler? Dr. Frederick Gates. Laut Frederick Gates injizierten sie den Soldaten zufällige Dosen eines experimentellen bakteriellen Meningitis-Impfstoffs. Diejenigen, die überlebten, wurden zu sogenannten Cloud Adults. Das heißt, sie verbreiteten die Bakterien an andere, auch an die Nicht-Geimpften. In modernen Covid-Tagen würden wir es als Shedding bezeichnen. Die Geimpften infizieren die Nicht-Geimpften. Was für ein erstaunlicher Zufall, nicht wahr? Frederick Gates damals, Bill Gates jetzt. Rockefeller-Initiative damals, Rockefeller-Initiative heute. Damals entwickelte sich die Krankheit in Fort Riley, USA, heute im Wuhan-Labor, China. Geschlossene Gesellschaften damals, geschlossene Gesellschaften heute. Cloud Adults damals, Shedding heute. Alles für unser eigenes Wohl, unsere eigene Sicherheit, damals und jetzt. und ein ganzes Jahrhundert dazwischen.
Das moderne Patent für diese mRNA-Technologie besagt, dass sie eine selbstorganisierende Lipid-Nanopartikel-Technologie enthält. Und jetzt, wo schätzungsweise 600 Millionen Dosen an die US-Öffentlichkeit verabreicht wurden, gibt Bill Gates dies zu.
Die Herstellung der mRNA ist wirklich einfach und billig. Und das ist der Clou an der Sache. Aber es besteht kein Zweifel, dass wir in den nächsten 5 Jahren, du weißt schon, wir müssen nur ein bisschen herumspielen. Es gibt viele Lipid-Nanopartikel und einige sind sehr selbstorganisierend. Und es gibt keinen Grund, warum sie nicht thermisch stabil, billig oder skalierbar sein sollten. Wenn wir also in den nächsten 5 Jahren diesen Teil des Problems in den Griff bekommen, werden wir in der Lage sein, weltweit Fabriken zu bauen, die $2 mit noch weniger Vorlaufzeit herstellen können, als wir es hier während der Pandemie tun mussten.
Bill sagt, diese mRNA-Spritzen seien leicht zu programmieren, um jede Art von Spike-Proteinerreger zu verabreichen. Und das moderne Patent listet mehrere auf. Über 100 Pathogene, die über längere Zeit kontrolliert freigesetzt werden können, sodass Todesfälle zufällig und mysteriös erscheinen. Während sie beschäftigt sind, zu versuchen herauszufinden, woher all die Herzinfarkte, der Turbokrebs und die neurologischen Erkrankungen kommen, sagt man ihnen, das sei auf den Klimawandel zurückzuführen und dass nun regelmäßige Pandemien zu erwarten sind. Während des Rollouts der experimentellen Impfungen.
Now, the two documents, I'll read them out to you. The cover page document says DTFN estimates for nano-domestic quell phase 4 updated compliance. And this is for the Assistant Director of Advanced Projects, the Office of DARPA Command, for the Department of Secretary of Defense eyes only. Then it describes nano-domestic quell in the other document. And it says that there needs to be more inflows of dispersal in Pepsi Company, 9.9% more, Nestle, 8.5% more. It goes on with the different percentages. Chicago Municipal, that's referring to the water supply. Atlantic Municipal, another water supply. Coca-Cola, Los Angeles Municipal, and Seattle Municipal. These are just a few of the very many areas that these things have infiltrated. To give you a little bit more of a heads up as to where these things are. Now, I have contacted my NASA contacts on this, and I have verification and confirmation from numerous sources. NASA, my NASA contacts have confirmed this, that this is true. And when I asked him for any kind of documentation that they could give me, they are not directly involved. He gave me the document. He said, this document has it all. It tells you pretty much everything. And so he was saying, yes, it's true, it's real, it's in the water, it's in all these other products. Not only that, it's in vaccines. The particular nanites that we're talking about are medical nanoscale devices, meaning they're so tiny you can barely see them, or you might not even be able to see them with the naked eye. They're customized with targeted drug delivery and cell death vehicles carrying large doses of agents, genetic material, or programming targeted to specific cells. Now, these particular nanites that we're talking about, let me get down here. These are the revolutionary kind of nanites that are constructed with a robust, smart nanostructure, and they detect specific cells and identify their location in the body. They can kill the cells or stay right where they are and confirm back having done the job. So they get this frequency and they get their working orders, they do their working orders, and then they report back what they've done when they're finished. Now, the nanites that he's talking about are made for one simple purpose, and they are to burrow into the bloodstream, gain entrance to the brain and other areas of the body in order to attach themselves to that tissue and lay in wait for classified military frequency signal to give them their working orders. At which time, they manipulate the brain and other areas of the body to send signals to those other areas of the body to affect what is called a cytokine storm. It's a sort of immune system feedback loop that is like your immune system on steroids. They cause the body's immune system to turn against itself and mimic virulent flu-like symptoms that develop into upper respiratory infection, fluid in the lungs, pneumonia, and eventually death. The target survival rate for the powers that be is 2%. Now they're saying that they want 99% of the populace infected with these things, and most of us are already. This program began in 1995.
Can these nanites be remotely activated, or are they pre-programmed to do their mission at a certain time on their own?
They are pre-programmed, but they are activated when they're given their working orders. Basically, when the military, the top secret classified military frequency is sent out, is emitted, they get that frequency order. Okay, now it's time to do your task. Once they're done with their task, they report back. Or if it's a continuing task, they report as they go. Now, a new report reveals that at least 104 food packaging, and agricultural products contain nano ingredients. They're now on sale internationally. These include diet replacement milkshakes, cooking oil, tea and fortified fruit juice, food additives, sold for use in processed meats, soft drinks, bakery and dairy products, long life and antibacterial food packaging. It's in the packaging, and antibacterial kitchenware.
The world today has 6.8 billion people. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
And vaccination is our best chance to do this. Vaccines have saved millions of lives in the past 50 years. But right now...
Welcome back. Were several Indian tribal girls used as guinea pigs? The report alleges that 2 American pharma giants' untested vaccine was administered to thousands of tribal girls without proper study and paperwork.
India was among the hardest hit after Bollywood celebrities were incentivized by the Gates Foundation to urge the public to submit to mass vaccinations. In 2009, tribal children were administered the HPV vaccine. Over 24,000 girls were told they were being given wellness shots, in many cases without the informed consent of a parent or a guardian.
The people that were administering these vaccines lied to the guardians of these girls and told the girls, oh, this is going to cure cancer, you're never going to have cancer. And these girls became severely injured. Some of them developed seizures, some of them developed cancer. And 7 girls died. And there was no insurance, there was no assistance for them. And the Gates Foundation denied that it had been clinical trials. And it was so bad that the parliament in India created a task force, they studied it, and they kicked out the Gates Foundation.
But right now, millions of children are still at risk. They need vaccines. We have the goal to vaccinate 500 million children by 2030. Europe will do its fair share. You can count on us, my friends.
We're taking things that are, genetically modified organisms, and we're injecting them in little kids' arms. We just shoot them right into the vein.
Amazing. This is pretty scary. This is wicked.
To make this future a reality, scientists want to teach nanobots to reproduce themselves. How? For instance, they will create numerous mini copies of themselves based on protein cells inside the human body. Nevertheless, futurologists are skeptical.
All these technologies are kind of like nuclear power. They're extremely powerful, maybe positive, but we have to control them. If we cannot control what we do there, it may cause a chain reaction.
According to so-called gray goo theory, microscopic robots will first annihilate humankind and then die out themselves, as they'll have consumed all the energy sources.
I just would like to highlight what you said about the European Chips Act, because it's an important step to create the physical brain for digitalization and to have it located to a certain extent in Europe.
It's an important step to create the physical brain for digitalization
and to have it located to a certain extent in Europe. I also, your reference to the Club of Rome report, the forum at that time launched actually the Club of Rome report.
Das Ausmaß von dem, was ich dir jetzt zeige, kannst du dir selbst aussuchen. Meiner Meinung nach werden jetzt hier einige Sachen geklärt. Schau dir mal dieses Bild hier an. Das Bild von einem Artikel, der am 19. Januar 2018 erschien. Der folgende Text stammt von kurzweil.ai.net, erschien aber ursprünglich in der Zeitschrift Science. Falls du mit dieser Darstellung und dem Text immer noch nichts anfangen kannst, mein Freund, ferngesteuerte DNA-Nanoroboter könnten zur ersten nanorobotischen Produktionsfabrik führen. Und damit meinen sie nicht, dass sie eine Fabrik errichten wollen, in der sie dann Nanoroboter bauen, sondern Nanoroboter in deinem Körper fabrikähnlich arbeiten. Schon lange fragt man sich, wieso so viel getestet wird. Ich habe von Anfang an gesagt, da ist was faul. Andere haben jetzt auf den Tests Fäden entdeckt. Seltsame schwarze Fäden, von denen sie sagen, es sei Morgellons. Morgellons ist aber eine eingebildete Krankheit, heißt es offiziell. Also wird man damit nicht weit kommen. Erscheint es nur so oder sind gerade bei uns in Deutschland die Maßnahmen am härtesten? Aufschluss könnte folgender Satz geben. Deutsche Forscher schufen eine 55 x 55 Nanometer große molekulare Plattform auf DNA-Basis mit einem 25 Nanometer langen Roboterarm, der mit von außen angelegten elektrischen Feldern unter Computersteuerung betätigt werden kann. Elektrische Felder wie zum Beispiel 4+1G. Indem sie einen selbstorganisierenden DNA-Nanoroboterarm mit elektrischen Feldern versorgten, haben deutsche Wissenschaftler eine präzise Bewegung im Nanomaßstab erreicht, die mindestens 5 Größenordnungen schneller ist als bisher berichtete DNA-getriebene Robotersysteme. Der nanorobotische Arm ähnelt dem Schalthebel eines Autos, gesteuert durch ein elektrisches Feld. Vergleichbar mit dem Autofahrer dienen kurze, einzelsträngige DNA als Riegel, gelb, um den 25 Nanometer langen Arm kurzzeitig zu greifen und in vordefinierten Gangpositionen zu arretieren. Biorobotik. Meiner Meinung nach ist es genau das, was man auf den PCR-Tests sieht. Und wenn du jetzt denkst, das wäre ja viel zu klein, 55 Nanometer groß, das würde niemals zu erkennen sein, dann pass auf. Die neuen biohybriden nanorobotischen Systeme könnten sogar als molekularmechanisches Gedächtnis fungieren, bemerkt er, mit der Fähigkeit, lange Fäden mit mehreren DNA-Roboterarmen zu bilden, könnten die Systeme auch als Plattform für neue Erfindungen in den Bereichen digitales Gedächtnis, Ladungstransfer im Nanomaßstab und 3D-Druck von Molekülen dienen. Hier alle Forscher: Enzo Copperga, Jonathan List, Sushi Madeira, ein Chinese also, Florian Rothfischer, Don C. Lamb, Friedrich C. Simmel, alle aus München. Der Artikel stammt, wie gesagt, aus der Science, Ausgabe vom 19. Januar 2018. Der Artikel ist also nun schon 3 Jahre alt. Mit Sicherheit kann dieser Roboterarm mittlerweile noch viel mehr. Aber auch der andere Inhalt der Ausgabe der Science ist relativ interessant. Die Grippe von 1918, 100 Jahre später.
Well, Elon Musk's next project isn't a car or a spaceship or a solar panel. The executive's latest startup is called Neuralink, which focuses on the goal of implanting chips into human brains and also connecting brains to computers. Here's what Elon Musk said at a conference in California about the technology last night.
This, I think, has a very good focus, which is to cure important diseases and ultimately to help secure humanity's future as a civilization relative to AI. This, I think, has tremendous potential, and we hope to have this aspirationally in a human patient before the end of next year. This is not far.
In an old video from 1995, a theology professor named Pierre Gilbert warned of mandatory vaccines that would turn recipients into zombies. He speaks in French, so I will translate. In the biological destruction, there are the organized tempests on the magnetic fields. What will follow is the contamination of the bloodstreams of mankind, creating intentional infections. This will be enforced via laws that will make vaccination mandatory. And these vaccines will make possible to control people. The vaccines will have liquid crystals that will become hosted in the brain cells, which will become micro-receivers of electromagnetic fields, where waves of very low frequencies will be sent. And through these low-frequency waves, people will be unable to think. You'll be turned into a zombie. Don't think of this as a hypothesis. This has been done. Think of Rwanda. There isn't much information I could find about Pierre Gilbert, but what he said 26 years ago certainly rings true today. In 2016, The Guardian published Genetically Engineered Magnetoprotein Remotely Controls Brain and Behavior. Here we can see zebrafish larvae that have been injected with magneto being manipulated with magnetic fields. In March of 2020, Defense One published an article on how hydrogel biosensors are ready to be injected into people's bodies, funded by DARPA and Bill Gates. If you search magnetic nanoparticles, you will find several articles and videos explaining the so-called benefits of this invasive technology that can control parts of the human body via external frequencies. Livestock needs to be branded and tracked, and the enslavement of humanity is voluntary, which is why the so-called vaccines are voluntary. And sadly, there seems to be millions of people eagerly lining up to be state property. For ReesReport.com, this is Greg Rees.
Kürzlich veröffentlichte Untersuchungen aus Korea und Japan bestätigen frühere Berichte, die wir hörten, über die Nanotechnologie in den Covid-19-Injektionsmitteln. Inhalt der Covid-19-Injektionsmittel von Pfizer und Moderna wurden unter einem Stereomikroskop mit 400-facher Vergrößerung untersucht. Die Proben wurden in verschiedenen Medien kultiviert, um ihre Wirkung auf lebende Zellen zu beobachten. Die Studie kam zu dem Schluss, dass die anormalen Verletzungen, die auftraten weltweit, seit die Injektionsmittel Milliarden von Menschen aufgezwungen wurden, verursacht wurden durch die nanotechnologischen Inhaltsstoffe der Covid-19-Injektionsmittel. Die Forschung fand Zelltoxizität und im Laufe weniger Wochen wuchsen einfache eindimensionale Strukturen zu komplexen dreidimensionalen Strukturen heran. Zahlreiche künstliche, sich selbst zusammensetzende Nanogrößenobjekte mit vielen verschiedenen Formen, darunter animierte, wurmartige Gebilde, Scheiben, Ketten, Spiralen, Röhren und rechtwinklige Strukturen, die andere künstliche Strukturen in sich tragen. Einige Strukturen schienen sogar mit der Zeit zu erscheinen und wieder zu verschwinden. Alles von dem, was gefunden wurde, war weit über dem erwarteten und akzeptablen Maß an Verunreinigung. Das wurde zuerst berichtet vor fast 3 Jahren von Ricardo Delgado und La Quinta Columna aus Spanien. Sie fanden einen Zusammenhang zwischen der Nanotechnologie und 5G. The Fifth Column veröffentlichte vor kurzem ihre Erkenntnisse und Schlussfolgerungen über die seltsame, selbstorganisierende Nanotechnologie, die sie in den mRNA-Impfstoffen von Pfizer mittels optischer Mikroskopieanalyse entdeckte. Die Objekte, die sie in dem Impfstoff fanden, korrespondierten mit bekannten Objekten aus der Wissenschaft. Und die Schlussfolgerung, zu der sie kommen, scheint ziemlich klar zu sein, dass das gut dokumentierte wissenschaftliche Ziel, Nanotechnologie in lebenden Menschen zu nutzen, um Netzwerke zu bilden, die in der Lage sind, mehrere Nanomaschinen zu kontrollieren, derzeit in den Covid-19-Impfstoffen umgesetzt wird. Was den größten Angriff auf die Menschheit in der gesamten Geschichte darstellt. Vor Jahrzehnten sagte der Silicon Valley-Guru Ray Kurzweil, dass im Jahr 2045 der größte Teil der menschlichen Zivilisation aus nicht-biologischen Maschinen bestehen wird, dank der Fortschritte von Nanorobotern, die Alterung und Tod heilen können. Während Gerede über mRNA leicht in den Mainstream vordringt, wird die Nanotechnologie ignoriert. Laut der Arbeit von La Quinta Columna gibt es kein mRNA-Spike-Protein. Laut ihren Forschungen dreht sich alles um die Nanotechnologie, welche, berichteten sie kürzlich, völlig zerstört werden kann durch eine Nikotinmischung aus Tabak und destilliertem Wasser. Hoffentlich wird diese Nikotinstudie wiederholt von anderen unabhängigen Wissenschaftlern, denn die Masseninfektion der Menschheit mit experimenteller Nanotechnologie wird ignoriert seit mindestens 3 Jahren. Und alle Seiten der politischen Führung lenken uns in eine schöne neue Welt der KI und des Internets der Dinge. Ein organisches menschliches Wesen zu sein, scheint keine Option zu sein.
Die neue Weltordnung ist der Versuch einer Gruppe Internationalisten, eine selbsternannte Elite, die ganze Welt zu kontrollieren durch eine von denen aufgebaute Weltregierung. Sie wird diktatorisch sein, nicht demokratisch gewählt, ein sogenannter Polizeistaat. Sie brauchen auch eine Weltarmee, eine Weltwährung, eine Weltreligion, eine Weltkultur. Privatbesitz wird nicht mehr toleriert und jeder Mensch wird registriert, bekommt eine Nummer und diese Daten werden auf einem Weltzentralcomputer gespeichert. Wenn die Völker, wenn die Menschen bewusst werden, was die Elite mit uns vorhat, dann wird es überall Bürgerkrieg geben. Und sie werden wahrscheinlich in Deutschland schwarzafrikanische Soldaten bekommen, wir in Australien wahrscheinlich türkische Soldaten und so weiter, so wie die Blauhelme heute. Die Welt wird bargeldlos, wir werden alle mit Smartcards arbeiten und jeder Pfennig, den Sie dann ausgeben, wird registriert. Sie müssen wissen, dass diese Elite keine Moral besitzen. Die sind auch nicht christlich noch islamisch. Sie stellen Satan und Gott gleich. Wenn die Grenzen und die Nationen verschwinden, verschwinden auch dann die Kulturen. Der Sinn der multikulturellen Gesellschaft ist sowieso eine Monokultur. Eine Mischgesellschaft, wo die Menschen das Zugehörigkeitsgefühl für ihre Nation verlieren. Und damit sind sie auch leichter zu kontrollieren.
Wie wird Privatbesitz weggenommen?
Privatbesitz wird wahrscheinlich nicht weggenommen, es wird nicht mehr toleriert, sondern es wird durch extrem hohe Gebühren sowie Wasser und Müll und hohe Steuern unmöglich gemacht werden, es zu halten. Jeder Mensch wird registriert, bekommt eine Nummer mit 18 Zahlen und diese Daten werden dann auf einem Weltzentralcomputer gespeichert.
We're taking things that are, genetically modified organisms and we're injecting them in little kids' arms. We just shoot them right into the vein.